What would make you leave everything behind? Your home, the place where your memories live, your family, the faces that feel like safety, your past, every moment that shaped who you are. What would make you walk away from all of it, knowing you might never come back, with no guarantee that where you're going will be better? No promise of safety, no promise of success, no clear picture of what's ahead, just uncertainty, just risk, just a quiet hope that something, somewhere, has to be different. Now imagine making that decision not alone, but as a people. Over 6 million Black Americans did exactly that. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't wait for permission. They made a move. They packed one suitcase, sometimes less than that, holding on to what they could carry and letting go of what they couldn't. They boarded trains, crowded, loud, unfamiliar, and stepped into the unknown, not knowing what they would find, not knowing who they would become on the other side.
Just knowing they couldn't stay where they were. This wasn't about comfort. This wasn't about convenience. This wasn't even about certainty. This was about survival, about choosing movement over being stuck, about choosing possibility over limitation, about choosing a future, even when it couldn't be seen yet. This is the Great Migration, one of the most powerful, most defining, most overlooked stories in Black history. A story of courage in motion, a story of people who refused to stay where they were not valued, and in doing so, changed the course of a nation forever. They didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because staying meant suffering, because staying meant waking up every day to a life already decided for them, limited, restricted, watched, controlled. Because staying meant silence in the face of injustice. Because staying meant teaching your children how to survive instead of how to dream. So they made a choice, not an easy one, but a necessary one. With one suitcase, sometimes less, a Bible, worn from prayers whispered in the dark, and a kind of faith they couldn't fully explain, but refused to let go of. Millions of Black families stepped onto trains, not dressed for comfort, but dressed for dignity. Not carrying everything they owned, but everything they could bear to leave with. They said quiet goodbyes to front porches, to dirt roads, to memories that held both love and pain. They didn't know what was waiting for them on the other side of those tracks. No guarantees, no promises, just a whisper of something better. But they knew exactly what they were leaving behind. They were leaving behind fields that took more than they gave, laws that saw them as less, and a system that tried to keep them small. So they boarded those trains, hearts heavy, but hope heavier. Every mile forward was a step away from oppression and a step toward possibility. Every mile forward was resistance. Every mile forward was courage. This was not just movement across land. This was movement toward freedom, toward identity, toward a future they had never been allowed to imagine. This was not just a journey. This was a declaration. This was a people saying, "We deserve more." This was the Great Migration. The Great Migration was one of the largest internal movements in American history. Not across oceans, not between countries, but within the borders of a nation that still struggled to see all of its people as equal. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans made a decision that would change their lives and reshape the future of this country. They left behind the rural South, the only home many of them had ever known, and began traveling to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, places they had heard about but had never seen. Places filled with promise, but also uncertainty. This wasn't a single moment, it was a movement that unfolded over decades. Wave after wave, family after family, generation after generation, answering the same question: what if life could be different? Because this wasn't just about relocation. It wasn't just about changing geography. It was about changing possibility. It was about stepping away from a system that limited who you could be and stepping towards something, even if it wasn't fully clear yet. This was about reclaiming dignity. The dignity to choose where you live, the dignity to work and be paid fairly, the dignity to exist without constant fear hanging over your life. This was about chasing freedom, not the freedom written on paper, but the freedom felt in everyday life. The freedom to walk without being watched, to speak without being silenced, to dream without being denied. All within a country that, at the time, still struggled to give that freedom equally. So they moved, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because the destination was perfect, but because staying meant settling for less than they deserved. And in that movement, they didn't just change their own lives, they changed the story of America. After slavery ended, freedom didn't fully arrive. Not the kind of freedom they had prayed for. Not the kind that lets you breathe without fear. Not the kind that lets you live without limits. Because even though chains were removed, control remained. Instead, a new system rose, quiet at first, but just as powerful. The system of Jim Crow laws. Laws that didn't just separate people, they defined their place. Where you could sit, where you could eat, where you could learn, where you could exist. Separate schools, separate trains, separate entrances, separate lives. But separate was never equal. Resources were limited, opportunities were denied, and dignity was constantly under attack. Every sign that said colored was a reminder. You are not seen the same. You are not treated the same. And behind those laws was something even more dangerous: violence. Not hidden, not rare, but present. Lynchings that turned terror into a public spectacle. Threats whispered and sometimes shouted to keep people in line. Fear that didn't clock out. Fear that didn't sleep. Fear that lived in the air, in the streets, in the silence between words. It wasn't just about laws, it was about control, about making sure no one stepped too far, dreamed too big, or reached beyond what they were allowed. And economically, the system tightened its grip. Many black families were trapped in sharecropping, a cycle that looked like work but functioned like bondage. They worked land they didn't own, for landowners who controlled everything: the crops, the prices, the debts. And no matter how hard they worked, the numbers never seemed to add up. At the end of the season, there was little to show for it. Sometimes nothing at all. Just more debt, more dependence, more waiting for a break that never came. So generation after generation, they labored, not building wealth, but maintaining survival, teaching their children not just how to live, but how to endure, how to be careful, how to stay quiet, how to make it through another day. Not how to get ahead, not how to thrive, but how to endure. How to wake up, step into a world that already had limits placed on you, and still find the strength to move. How to speak carefully, walk carefully, live carefully, because one wrong move, one wrong word could change everything. So survival became a skill, a learned behavior, passed down quietly, from one generation to the next, not always spoken out loud, but understood. Dreams were delayed, not because they lacked vision, but because the system refused to see it. Talents went unnoticed, ideas went unsupported, potential went unrealized, not due to lack of ability, but lack of access. Opportunities were blocked, not by chance, but by design. Doors closed before they could even be reached, paths cut off before they could even begin. And even when a door cracked open, it came with conditions, restrictions, limitations, barriers that reminded them this space wasn't built with you in mind. And futures? Futures were never certain. They were negotiated, day by day, decision by decision, calculated under pressure. Do you stay or do you leave? Do you speak or do you stay silent? Do you risk everything or protect what little you have? Every choice carried weight. Every step required strategy, because the margin for error was small and the consequences were real. They weren't just planning for tomorrow. They were navigating today with everything on the line. They weren't just living, they were surviving. Surviving systems, surviving circumstances, surviving a reality that constantly asked them to be less than who they truly were. And survival came at a cost. The cost of rest, the cost of peace, the cost of freedom not fully realized. It cost time. It cost opportunity. It cost generations the chance to simply exist without resistance. But even in that, even in survival, there was strength, there was endurance, there was a quiet, unshakable determination to keep going. even when the odds said stop. So why did millions leave? Why would families walk away from everything they knew? Their homes, their communities, their roots? Because the South pushed them out. It pushed them out with laws that limited their lives, with systems that kept them stuck, with fear that followed them from sunrise to sunset. It pushed them out with ceilings they couldn't break, and doors that were never meant to open. But at the same time, the North pulled them in. Not perfectly, not completely, but powerfully enough to spark hope. Because during World War I and later World War II, America was changing. Factories were expanding, production was rising, and millions of jobs needed to be filled. With many white workers sent overseas to fight, industries turned their attention elsewhere, and suddenly, there was opportunity. Steel mills, railroads, meatpacking plants, automobile factories. Places that had once been closed began to open, just enough. And for the first time, steady wages felt possible. Not perfect wages, but better than what many had known. Better than debt that never ended. Better than working land that was never yours. And the message spread. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender didn't just report news, they carried hope. They printed stories of Black families finding work, earning. The journey wasn't easy. It wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't guaranteed. For many, leaving had to be done in silence. Some slipped away in the early hours of the morning, before the sun could expose their plans, afraid that if word got out, they'd be stopped. By landowners, by threats, by a system that wasn't ready to let them go. So they moved quietly, carefully, with courage wrapped in caution. Others took a different path. They gathered their families, stood in doorways a little longer, looked out at the land that had shaped them, and said quiet goodbyes. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Because deep down, they didn't know if they would ever return. They packed what they could carry, not everything they owned, but everything they could hold on to. A suitcase filled with clothes, maybe a photograph, a keepsake, something to remember where they came from. And everything else, they left it behind. Homes built over generations, fields that held both labor and memory, communities that raised them, even if those communities were shaped by struggle. They left behind more than things. They left behind familiarity and stepped into the unknown. Train rides stretched for hours, sometimes days. Seats were crowded, aisles were full, and some stood the entire way, holding on to hope like it was something you could grip. Through the windows, the South slowly faded. The roads, the trees, the land, and with every passing mile, something shifted. Every mile north was a step towards something different. Not easy, not guaranteed, but different. Different meant possibility. Different meant movement. Different meant maybe, just maybe, a life where they could breathe a little easier. And even though uncertainty rode with them, so did something stronger. Hope. Hope that their children might live better. Hope that their work might finally mean something. Hope that somewhere, on the other side of those tracks, life could be more than survival. Not perfect, but different. The migration didn't stop. It didn't end with the first wave. And it didn't fade once people reached the north. It evolved. Because the need didn't disappear. The hope didn't disappear. And the search for something better was still alive. A second wave began to rise, stronger, wider, and even more determined. This time, the movement stretched beyond the north. It reached toward the west, toward cities that promised new beginnings and a different kind of opportunity. Black families packed their lives once again, some for the first time, others for the second. Still chasing stability, still chasing dignity, still chasing a life that felt like it belonged to them. They moved to places like Los Angeles and Oakland, cities growing rapidly, filled with industry, defense jobs, and possibility, especially during and after wartime expansion. The roads were different this time. Highways instead of rail lines, cars instead of crowded train cars. But the feeling was the same. Uncertainty, courage, hope. Because even though the destination had changed, the question remained, will it be better here? They carried that question with them, just like those before them. And just like before, the answer wasn't simple. Opportunity existed, but so did barriers. New cities, but familiar struggles. Different streets, but similar systems. And still, they kept moving. Because movement meant possibility. Movement meant they refused to stay where they were not valued. Movement meant they believed, even after everything, that something better was still out there. So they searched, not just for jobs, not just for housing, but for space. Space to grow, space to breathe, space to live without constant resistance, searching still for something better. The Great Migration changed everything. It didn't just move people, it moved the direction of a nation. It reshaped cities, turning quiet industrial spaces into thriving cultural centers. It reshaped culture, giving rise to music, art, language, and identity that would influence the world. It reshaped America, not just physically, but spiritually. Because when millions of people rise up and decide to move towards something better, that kind of movement leaves a mark. It helped lay the foundation for the civil rights movement, a movement that would challenge injustice on a national stage. A movement fueled by the very people who once boarded those trains, carrying hope, carrying pain, carrying a vision of something more. But more than statistics, more than timelines, more than history books, the Great Migration told a story, a human story, a story of people who refused to stay where they were not valued, who refused to accept limits placed on their lives, who chose uncertainty over oppression, who chose movement over stagnation. A story of courage in the face of fear, of strength in the face of resistance, of faith in moments when there was no guarantee that things would get better, and yet they moved anyway. A story of movement, not just across land, but across identity, across generations, across what was, into what could be. And that movement, it didn't end. It echoes in the music we hear, in the cities we walk through, in the voices that continue to rise and refuse to be silenced. It echoes in every step forward taken in the name of freedom. Because the truth is, they weren't just running from something, they were running from fear, from limitation, from systems that tried to define them. But even more than that, they were walking towards something, toward dignity, toward opportunity, toward identity, toward a future they had every right to claim. They were walking toward who they were always meant to become. And because they did, we are here. Standing on the legacy of their courage, living in the space they fought to create, and carrying forward a story that still deserves to be told. So if this story matters to you, if their journey means something to you, don't just watch it, remember it, carry it, honor it. Comment legacy below.